The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club. We continue to discuss Geoffrey Shaw's The Lost Mandate of Heaven, story of Diem. No, you say?
Sounds like a gnocchi.
Seems like a negative. But just off camera here, we had a discussion briefly because Thomas, who had just become the father of James Jacoby, was saying that while holding his child with both hands and not able to do much else, he was watching a documentary on Vietnam by Ken Burns. And Thomas, what did you see or hear from that?
Well, on the one hand, the documentary comes out pretty strongly against Diem. They describe him as increasingly autocratic, but I got the sense that they were using that term to mean kind of un-American in his ways. He was sort of not a good puppet, so to speak, of the American. But that's not, they don't put it that way. But they describe him as increasingly autocratic, and they emphasize his what they call oppressions of the Buddhists, and so he's a kind of dictator. Then on the other hand, you see, well, for one, as soon as the coup happened, where Diem wound up murdered, you see President Kennedy immediately regretting what he had approved, and he sort of approved it, thinking that his advisors had approved it when they hadn't. He was just going on bad intelligence in a way. But Vice President Johnson at the time, LBJ, they show him he was adamantly opposed to backing this coup from the very beginning, and when it happened, it was kind of just like, didn't I tell you? Look at the mess we're in. And then, of course, he became president. Little did he know he'd become president just like a month later after the coup happened. It's wild. And then he had to basically sleep in the bed that he didn't want made to begin with. But it's interesting that they show both sides of that.
Well, that's a good thing. Those who are watching this, listening to this, may want to look at that and kind of compare it, because there's a larger generic issue. I can understand that if we Americans are trying to be generous, we're trying to help these countries, we're supporting them. Now, we've got our own interests too, but if we're going to put in money and risk the lives of our own citizens on your battlefields, then we want some say in how things are prosecuted, how things are run and how they're led. But it seems to me from this book, which also corresponds to my other experiences, that we tend not to understand what the other person's moccasins are like to walk in. And we have this this idea of liberal democracy is the future of everyone. We have to begin it as soon as possible. We can't have any, strong leaders who are autocratic. I don't know. It's
well, there's the difference between autocratic leaders and autocratic systems, and that's what they're set up to be. Someone like Diem, who's fighting a counterinsurgency, he has every intention of restoring democratic local rule in the villages once they're secured. And so he's not an autocrat in the same way as other autocrats might be. I think you have to make a distinction between a wartime leader and a person who that is their system. That's the way they do things. Diem, that was not the way he was Western educated by the French Catholic. He was not an autocrat by nature, anything of the sort.
I mean, in the UK during World War II, you couldn't stand up in public and support Hitler. If you did that, you'd be put in prison, right? There are limits to free speech that are just real politic when there's a war going on, and we need to judge Diem from the point of view of the fact that he's on a war footing, right? These are not times of peace. This is times of war, and if you don't judge him on that basis, you may as well call Churchill an autocrat.
Right.
Yes, and that's a true general principle. But as you mentioned, Vivian. I'm sorry, I had too many wines at lunch. I mean, the documents show, and Jeffrey Shaw is very good at quoting these documents, that Diem was for democracy, but he wanted to start from the bottom up, little by little, these villages, and show them something that they could have against the Vietnamese incursions and insurgency, and then let that trickle up to the top instead of trying to impose it from the top and hoping it'll trickle down.
Also, we get in this book the documentation from a lot of observers on the ground in Vietnam. And so, you know, I have the greatest respect for Ken Burns's documentary skills. I absolutely loved his one on the Civil War. But, you know, if you're relying on commentators from here, you know, who are relying on commentators of the time, and you're no longer listening to the voices anymore of the people who were actually there on the ground, Americans and Vietnamese, I think you'd get a different view. So and that's what we're going to be discussing today, because we're going to look at two very different ambassadors and what their opinions of Diem were. Two completely different opinions of the same man, right?
And both of them very talented and qualified ambassadors.
That's right.
Sure.
That's right. So you could be looking at the same person and have different people draw different conclusions.
Which obviously is up to the point is a derivative of that person, of the observer's own philosophy of things, right? That you can be looking at the same person, but if you're coming at that person from your own philosophical perspective, you're going to judge him differently. And I think that's the issue here.
Right, and this ambassador, Elbridge
Durbro,
okay, apparently was very competent and experienced, but in European diplomacy. But he was not. He tried to use that same framework to understand Southeast Asia, and didn't work.
Well, you can see why he was brought in, because on page 1 it explains that he had experience with the Soviets under Stalin, and he had a shrewd and realistic understanding of the ruthless political machine America was dealing with in Moscow. And so it's true that the Soviets were backing the North Vietnamese. And so this was a kind of proxy war in the Cold War dynamics between the US and the USSR. So, you know, that isn't unreasonable. Take a man with that background and send him to Vietnam to figure out what is going on. But
but again, the issue is, of course, that the Vietnamese are not Russians, right?
That's right.
They might be, you know, having the same ideology, but they're not the same people.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Well, as he says on page 58, end of that new paragraph at the beginning there, or the old paragraph, the problem, though, was that Indochina was not Eastern Europe.
That's right.
And of course, Indochina is what was called under the French rule.
Right.
And we have to remember that there had already been a kind of revolution against the French. Why? Because of colonial influence, of their being, you know, the ones who are in charge of our country. So now, when the French are out and the North Vietnamese want to come in, what's their big argument? You guys should just exchange France for the United States. You know, for one foreign, you know, puppeteer for another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And of course, they were also concerned by the growing strength of the Viet Cong. That shows up on the bottom of 58. In the case of both Durbros and this Avril Harriman, who was at the State Department at the same time. And they're seeing the growing strength of the Viet Cong and the ongoing weaknesses in the South Vietnamese army. And on top of it, they're dissatisfied with Diem's government not behaving the way that's going to look good in the eyes of the press. That's going to come out more and more. Yes. It's the jury of public opinion as it gets distilled by the American media, that these politicians, let's face it, these are political animals, these men, all of them, and they're always, you know, weighing, well, what, you know, what's going to happen in American domestic politics, what's happening in American domestic politics as it's being influenced by the New York Times and the Washington Post, and I got to pay attention to that or my career is on the line.
Well, that's the very scary thing about it, right, is that everything is subject to public opinion in the United States because everyone's thinking about the next election.
That's right.
And that's not any objective way of dealing with an issue of this sort. And in this case, of course, had absolutely disastrous ramifications.
That's right.
And, you know, I naively thought in the 50s and 60s that the press was just some, group that reported on things and they told you what happened.
Right.
But we see here that what I find happening now was happening then, that the noxious influence of the American media on foreign policy and domestic policy too. And so if out there is anyone listening to us or watching us, young person aspiring to be, journalist, please pray about that. We need good journalists, good reporters, good investigative reporters that will be objective and balanced and true to the facts,
Now, one of the reasons why this impatience with the South Vietnamese army not performing to American expectations is because Diem is trying to go into a different direction militarily wise. He's trying to follow this British model of counterinsurgency, something that the American military establishment is not familiar with. And so it even says that, let's see, on page 59 in the middle, the Americans were loath to let Diem develop the kind of forces needed to break an insurgency, meaning well-equipped special constabulary and police. Yet it was precisely these sorts of forces drawn from local Vietnamese who could live in the rural communities and thus secure an intimate understanding of the people they were seeking to protect. And then down a few lines, the British had demonstrated that the strategic use of local policing was crucial in effective counterinsurgency warfare, and they had made this type of police program the foundation of their success against communist guerrillas in Malaya from 1948 to 1960. And it just so happened that yesterday on the phone, I was talking to one of our Ignatius Press authors about a book of his. And so, what are you reading these days, Vivian? He wants to know. And I mentioned this book. Turns out this man's father worked on the counterinsurgency plan for Vietnam back during the Vietnam War in Washington. And he validated the things I was saying I was learning about this book, the complete terrorization of the countryside, the murder of anytime local leaders who were being trained and raised up at the local level, they were just murdered mercilessly by the communists. So it was interesting to get a perspective that is in this book that I had not read anywhere else until I read this book.
Can I also use an analogy from my own experience in life, something very similar? The American model is military intervention. And what Diem wants is to police it, right? Ideally with local police. During the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which I was involved in, at the beginning of it, the Protestant majority in Belfast were actually attacking the Catholic minority. They were just going through and bombing the houses and what have you. And the British Army came in as a peacekeeping force to stop the Protestants from attacking the Catholics. When the British Army came in, the Catholic people in Belfast were bringing the soldiers cups of tea. They were absolutely very relieved and pleased to see them there to protect them. But the army remained, and then the IRA turned the Catholics against the British Army, but now they were seen as an army of occupation, even though they were brought in to protect and preserve the peace, right? So once you have a military presence, it's very easy for people to say, no, this is an occupation. These are enemy soldiers. So they came as welcome liberators from tyranny and became within 6 months military occupiers. And then the victims of terrorism from the very same community that they'd come in to actually protect.
And that's why when we use this phrase, we have to win the hearts, this slogan, we have to win the hearts and minds of the people. Yes, you do, but you don't win the hearts and minds of the people with a foreign occupying army.
Right.
You have to build up their own people to defend themselves with their own local armed groups or whatever. But anyone who really doesn't want to let go of control of a country and let them determine themselves, is it going to let that happen?
Let's pause on this a little longer because I think it has contemporary value too. We have to remember that World War II has not been long in the past. And what had happened there? American very formidable military presence, huge equipment, and intelligence and manpower and so on. And the Russians had too. In America, we think that we won the Second World War, but Russians think they won it. And there's a case for both sides in that. And without either one of us, probably it would have been lost. But the Americans, with this already now highly mobilized, highly efficient, massive military organization, is concerned there might be a big invasion of the Viet Cong into South Vietnam, a World War II-like invasion. So they want to prepare for that by having this military presence that could resist that.
That's right.
But that wasn't what was happening.
But one thing that really surprised me, Father, when I read this book, I haven't got a page reference now, but I read it today, so it's in this section we're approaching, is how actually the American military was undermanned by the late 1950s. Because the military command said that basically if we commit 10,000 troops to Vietnam, we won't have enough people. If there's another problem somewhere else, we won't have enough military to deal with it. So I think that probably one consequence of the Vietnam War was the cranking up of the American military. But it seemed at the end of the 1950s, we said here that if we commit 10,000 soldiers, 10,000 troops to Vietnam, we will not have enough to deal with another problem if it happens somewhere else. In other words, if the Soviets then use this as an excuse to go somewhere else, we will be deployed elsewhere. We will not have enough people.
Okay, that was the case. However, our mindset of how you approach war was you need this massive organization of troops. And because we just came out of war, it would not have taken long to mobilize 1 million men in 1950. They'd already been fought. They had the experience. The problem in Ukraine now is you can't train an army in 6 months or a month to operate, especially now. It's even more complicated with technical equipment and stuff like that. You just can't say, oh, let's recruit these people, put them on the battlefield. No.
Well, we also have to remember that in between World War II and Vietnam was the Korean War.
Well, that's true.
All right. And that's why when we get to the Laotian question, the U.S. military was actually saying we were going to have to use tactical, if we were going to try a military solution to Laos, we were going to have to use tactical nuclear weapons.
Yeah, that again, it's all here. So we talked about this. I've highlighted this passage as well. Is that we have the choice if we try to do the things the same way within Korea. In other words, we're pulling our punches because we have nuclear weapons. If we pull our punches, we'll end up like Korea. We will not win.
That's right.
So I either don't fight. I use nuclear weapons. Well, that's a very scary scenario, right?
That's right. Which is why JFK wanted a diplomatic solution to Laos, but we were, when you're given this either or, and the one thing that the man in Vietnam is trying to do for his own people, which is build up his own country and build up their own ability to defend themselves against communism on every level, social, economic, military in the sense of local militia, religious, the building up the Buddhist culture that had been broken down under French rule. This idea that Thomas mentioned that appears to be in this documentary that he was anti-Buddhist is just not true. In fact, this friend I was talking to yesterday, this author whose father was working in counterinsurgency, said the Buddhist monasteries that were pro-North Vietnamese had been infiltrated by the communists. We knew that. And so that Shaw is going to explain that later on. But also, what it really comes down to, why didn't the Americans let Diem go about this the way he wanted to? And on page 60, there it is, the bottom of that graph. British ideas for countering insurgents by a circumspect approach therefore became an area of disagreement between the British advisory team and the American Military Assistance Advisory Group, which, after all, was under instructions from Washington not to let Diem have total control of the counterinsurgency plan. We didn't really want Vietnam to determine its own destiny, did we? We wanted to control Vietnam.
Well, we thought it was
Vivi, I
destiny.
Yes.
with everything you said there. But where was that? You said the bottom of page 60. I'm not
The
seeing that.
bottom of the top graph on page 60.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. I beg your pardon. Okay. Mm-hmm.
And then on the Buddhist Catholic question,
Yes, very important.
the very next paragraph, did you want to highlight that?
Well, I did. That another concern we had was that, especially since Kennedy was a Catholic, that Diem was appointing too many Catholics in high positions during his cabinet. But as Shaw makes clear here, under the French occupation or rule, which helped the educational system a great deal, what were the schools? They were Catholic schools, Catholic religious schools. And so the most educated Vietnamese were not the Buddhists, but they were the Catholics.
And the most loyally anti-communist Vietnamese were also Catholics.
Because many had escaped North Vietnam.
Yes. In fact, I have a little factoid here. I was looking up on the Vietnam War. In 1956, 450,000 Vietnamese fled from the north into the south because under the brutal dictatorship of Ho Chi Minh, the people were we heard their farms were being collectivized. There was religious persecution. So the whole time that everyone's got their focus on Diem and how horrible he is, what are you comparing him against?
Yeah, and it seems to me that the subplot here is anti-Christianity, right? But specifically anti-Catholicism. Especially we're talking about the liberal media, right? You've got this Catholic. You've still got this at this time, by the way. You have Franco in charge of Spain, who's despised right by the liberal media. Diem's a Catholic autocrat. In other words, he's like Franco. You have to bring him down. So they're not even looking at the bigger picture. They have no idea of nuance. Right? It's all absolute reaction based upon a two-dimensional understanding of reality.
Yes, yes. And there's another line on the Catholic point here on 61 that because of their Western education, the Vietnamese Catholics offered the best chance of building anything remotely like a Western-style democracy.
Yeah.
Isn't that ironic?
Yeah, absolutely. That is very ironic. It's just saying that the anti-Catholicism of the secular liberal media prevents the democracy they're calling for, that Diem was the only possible conduit to achieve.
As we're going
upon irony upon irony.
And you're going to see in the next chapters on Ambassador Nolting and so on that this was the opinion when others finally arrive in Vietnam and start taking the measure of what's going on. They all come to this conclusion: Diem is the best hope for this country, and America has got to learn to work with him. The CIA came to that conclusion.
Just below that, Vivian. I mean, bearing in mind what we just were saying, what's Diem think about this? The lack of understanding we've just been talking about amongst the Western media and Western politicians that are marionettes to the Western media. Diem looked upon the Americans as, quote, great big children, well-intentioned, powerful, with a lot of technical know-how, but not very sophisticated in dealing with him or his race or his country's problems.
That's right.
So Diem could see the two-dimensional aspect of the American response to the situation on the ground, which was nuanced, which was rooted in Vietnam, right? That needed to be understood as such and not just be a toy of Western media's ideological predilections.
Well, I'm going to make what may be or construed to be a racist remark here, because in my experience, long experience now, maybe because they're the ones that stand out or are in the news, but story after story of these Vietnamese refugees who come here don't speak English, and there's no connection with Vietnamese and English. It's not like French to English or Italian or something like that, or Spanish. They come at age 12, going to a high school, they become valedictorian.
Yeah.
Or my barber, Paula Lai, she was a boat person.
Yep.
They brought her to Houston, Texas. They trained her for a while. She learned language for a couple of months, and they gave her $1,000 a month, I guess, to be able to rent an apartment and try and get a job. I mean, she's got her own business that she runs. Phenomenal.
Yeah.
But again, that may just be the ones that I happen to have seen anecdotally, and they may be just as average as everybody else. But boy, my experience is the Vietnamese are not some kind of a subculture or
no
inferior culture.
No, they're industrious, they're smart, they're hardworking, they're enterprising. And by the way, the ones that are Catholic are very Catholic. And in Orange County now, California, where a lot of the boat people ended up, there's just a huge representation of Vietnamese in the Catholic Church. And I met a nun who was a boat person, like from the age of 5 to the age of 10. She was on the run with her family from after the fall of Saigon. And I mean, and she's telling me all these stories of absolute horror and terror, everything else. And she's just glowing with this smile and this joy and this love of Jesus. I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that we have you here.
Yeah, I mean, two stories which I find very diametrically opposed parts of the spectrum. When I was involved in radical neo-Nazi politics as a young man, we were very opposed to the Vietnamese boat people coming to England. We don't want these immigrants in the country. So, again, two-dimensional, just not seeing anything except the fact they're foreigners, xenophobia. But then the other extreme is my brother-in-law, my wife's brother, married a Singaporean girl. So he lives in Singapore. They come over to Orange County. That's what made me think about it. It's Orange County. And they go to a part of Orange County, what it's called now, with all these Vietnamese restaurants. And I said, well, why? You live in Singapore. Why would you come to America and go to this place with the Vietnamese restaurants? He says, because the food here is better than it is where we come from, right? These Vietnamese have preserved that culture to such a degree that the best Oriental food that my brother-in-law, who lives in Singapore, can get is to come to Orange County.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Tom's not going to agree with that because he thinks that Cajun cooking probably is far superior to anything you could get.
Cajun cooking is the best American cuisine, bar none. I'm with Thomas.
But there's a very strong Vietnamese culture in South Louisiana. A lot of the boat people wind up in South Louisiana because the climate's very similar because it's so hot. And so there's very fine Vietnamese restaurants. And a lot of our vocations in the priesthood come from the Vietnamese community.
Yeah,
but they spell their names funny. I don't know how to pronounce them.
Oh, yeah.
Can I make one off?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I know
Why
I'm
not?
off camera, but so I'm watching this. I'm spending many hours watching this Ken Burns documentary, and I don't know if you know who Major Charles Beckwith was. Sergeant Charlie. He was a major in Vietnam. He created the Delta Force. He was a very major figure in the Vietnam War, and he led many successful battles. And after one battle in 1965, they interviewed Major Beckwith, and they asked him, what do you think of the soldiers, the Viet Cong you've been fighting? What do you think of these Vietnamese soldiers you're fighting against? And he paused for about 10 seconds. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'd give anything to have 200 of these men under my command. These are the finest soldiers I've ever seen. And he was just absolutely astounded at for one, their courage and their sense of self-sacrifice, but also just their intelligence and their ability to work as a unit and how quickly, just their skills as riflemen. And he said they were the finest soldiers he'd ever seen. And so that's just another testament to how gifted these people are,
I'll tell you as well, what would be very interesting, Thomas, listening to that, is what were they sacrificing themselves for?
Right.
Were they really sacrificing themselves for Karl Marx and that Western ideology, or were they sacrificing themselves because they're Vietnamese and they wanted to fight against an occupying army?
That's right.
So I think a lot of them, the Viet Cong, they weren't communists. They were from their perspective, freedom fighters,
That's right. So where do we want to go now? I mean, we see that this Ambassador Durbro, who doesn't get Diem, doesn't trust him, doesn't think he's the right man for the job, he submits this memo. that
Well,
didn't
what I
go.
suggest, what I suggest, Vivian, is we've had a very good discussion because all of us have read these chapters, and what we've done is talked about it in a general panoramic perspective. Is that we consider the chapter on Ambassador Eldridge Durbro done and dusted, and we continue chapter 3 at the beginning of the next session.
I think that's probably a good idea because this is just fleshing. The rest of the chapter just fleshes out what we've already said, I think.
Yeah, we've talked about it panoramically. We've read it. We've talked about it
Mhm.
generally without engaging with the particular passages.
Oh, I would like to point to one little thing.
Please.
Because, okay, so these Viet Cong are fighting so fiercely and heroically and skillfully because they see themselves as fighting for their own country against a foreign invasion and occupation. And so, the communists, that means that the communist propaganda worked in convincing them that their best interest, lay with the communists. Okay. And so you see throughout the book these elements of how communists wage propaganda war so effectively. And there's another point I wanted to bring up about having been a leftist, and radical.
The two of you have.
But he was on the right and I was on the left.
Saying,
We'd have thrown bricks at each other in the old
but
days.
it's interesting.
I would have been throwing Molotov cocktails, not just bricks.
Well, you're more organized than I was then.
No kidding. But I just wanted to point another one of these communist tricks of the trade on 64. Part of the reason why leftist trained groups use terror tactics, and the more gruesome and horrifying and terrifying, the better, is because it's going to bring about a response, a brutal military response. Okay, we don't need to think much further about what's going on right now. And then that very response is going to prove the moral evil of the other side, that the communists or leftists trained by other leftist groups trained by communists. It proves their case, you see, that the other side is the monster. We just killed a few people and now they're coming and bombing the whole place to pieces, right? And this is a key propaganda tool of communist insurgencies.
Because it only works, of course, if your opponent has an eye for an eye mentality, right? If you know your opponent is not only going to react but overreact,
that's
then
right.
You provoke him, right?
You provoke him. That's right. You provoke the reaction deliberately, which shows you the cynical disregard for human life on their side.
By the way, that's not what eye for eye means. In fact, the eye for eye, tooth for tooth was precisely to prevent that.
Right.
The idea was in Judaism, if he takes your out, you take his out. You don't take both eyes out and cut off his hands.
Thank you, Father.
Right.
That's a really important correction.
There's a very, very important nuance and clarification. But I was speaking more generically that basically,
right. Because sometimes we use eye for eye.
Necessary.
Yeah, sometimes we use the metaphor to
for vengeance.
Yeah. But in fact, the eye for eye was to limit the lust for vengeance, right? So thanks. That's an important clarification.
I agree with your idea, but I want to use two quick quotes, one on 63, because 3 lines down, as far as press relations were concerned, Diem said that the foreign press should try to be more objective. They sought out only those stories which were sensational and critical of the government and ignored many favorable success stories. And that, of course, bad news sells better than good news,
That's right.
Yeah. New paragraph towards the bottom. In this context, the role that the American liberal news media played in destroying the relation between No Dien Diem and the U.S. government should not be underestimated. And then finally on page 64, this kind of summarizes the whole thing. But just before that paragraph at the bottom, the simple truth was that these two contradictory demands the U.S. is making to Vietnam, that is democracy and counterinsurgency, could not be reconciled with the political reality that existed in South Vietnam at the time. That was it.
Yes, that was Diem's dilemma.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you at the next session. God bless you.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.